In 1856, the Xhosa people of South Africa lost a war they never fought. No army defeated them. No siege starved them out. Instead, a 15-year-old girl stood at a river and whispered something to her uncle. And within 12 months, 400,000 cattle were dead, 40,000 people had starved, and the British had seized 600,000 acres of now empty land without firing a single significant shot. What did she say at that river? Why did an entire nation believe her? And was it really a prophecy, or was something far more calculated happening in the shadows? The Xhosa people of the Eastern Cape had been watching their world collapse for years before Nongqawuse ever spoke. Beginning in 1853, a catastrophic bovine lung sickness epidemic, carried by European settler cattle, swept through the region and killed tens of thousands of Xhosa animals. Cattle were not simply livestock to the Xhosa. They were currency, bride price, spiritual offering, and the measure of a man's worth in the world. To lose your cattle was to lose your identity. Simultaneously, the British were pressing inward after a series of colonial frontier wars. Land was being seized. Chiefs were being humiliated. The nation was exhausted, demoralized, and desperate. Into that desperation, a prophecy arrived. Nongqawuse was an orphan. She lived under the guardianship of her uncle Nongqawuse, a man with an unusual history. Before returning to Xhosa traditional life, Nongqawuse had lived in Cape Town and been baptized as a Christian under the name Wilhelm Goliath. He had absorbed Western religious frameworks, resurrection, covenant, divine punishment, and then carried them back into the world of Xhosa ancestor belief. When his teenage niece returned from the Gxarha River claiming to have heard ancestral voices, Nongqawuse did not dismiss her. He translated her visions into formal theological language and carried the prophecy directly to Chief Xarhili. Without Nongqawuse's amplification, the visions of a 15-year-old girl might have faded into local rumor. With him, they became national policy. The prophecy's commands were absolute and specific. Every head of cattle must be slaughtered, not culled, not reduced, but entirely eliminated. Every grain store must be emptied or burned. All farming must stop immediately. No new crops could be planted. In exchange, on a divinely specified date, February 18, 1857, the sun would rise blood red. A great wind would roll in from the sea. The British colonizers would be swept from the land. From beneath the earth, the resurrected Xhosa ancestors would emerge leading vast herds of perfect, healthy, disease-free cattle. Grain stores would overflow. All the dead would walk again. The nation only had to trust the ancestors completely and purify itself through total sacrifice. There was no middle ground. Partial belief was not belief at all. For the prophecy to spread beyond one village, it needed a champion, and it found one in the most powerful man in the Xhosa nation. Chief Xarhili, paramount chief of the Kalika Xhosa, traveled personally to the Gxarha River to hear the ancestral voices for himself. He returned a total believer. Within weeks, Xarhili personally oversaw the slaughter of his own royal herd. Animals that represented the pinnacle of Xhosa wealth and status accumulated across generations. When the paramount chief destroyed his own cattle, the signal to every Xhosa person was unmistakable. This was not a request. This was a divine command endorsed by the highest human authority in the land. Across the territory, the mass slaughter began. Between May 1856 and January 1857, the Xhosa people slaughtered an estimated 400,000 cattle. The scale of that number demands a moment of stillness. 400,000 animals, the entire national herd. Kraals that had once held hundreds of prized beasts fell silent. The carcasses rotted where they fell, unable to be processed, the stench drifting across the grasslands for miles. Fields that had grown sorghum and maize stood empty. Grain pits were emptied or sealed. For the Xhosa, each act of destruction was simultaneously an act of faith, a covenant payment made in advance of the promised reward. Every dead cow was a deposit on the resurrection. The deeper the sacrifice, the greater the certainty that the ancestors could not possibly let it go unanswered. Not everyone obeyed. Across Xhosa society, a fracture opened between two factions that would deepen into something close to civil war. Believers called themselves the Amatamba, the submissive ones, the righteous. Those who refused to kill their cattle were labeled Amagogodia, the hard ones, the faithless. The hard ones were ostracized from their communities. In some cases, their cattle were killed by believing neighbors acting on social pressure and prophetic mandate. Families broke apart along the fault line of belief. When early prophecy deadlines passed without the promised miracle, the movement did not collapse, it adapted. The failure was blamed on the hard ones. Insufficient faith had blocked the resurrection. More sacrifice was required. The logic was airtight and inescapable. If you doubted, you were the reason it hadn't worked yet. By late 1856, the cattle were mostly gone and the granaries followed. Xhosa families burned or emptied stores of grain that represented not months, but years of agricultural work. The accumulated food security of entire households destroyed in an afternoon. There is a psychological mechanism at work here that historians and behavioral economists have since named escalating commitment to a losing course of action. Put simply, the more you have sacrificed, the more impossible it becomes to admit the sacrifice was wrong. Walking away from the prophecy now meant accepting that every dead cow, every emptied grain store, every burned harvest had been for nothing. The mind refuses that conclusion. So instead it demands more faith, more sacrifice, more proof of commitment, and the trap closes a little tighter around everyone inside it. On the night of February 17, 1857, hundreds of thousands of Xhosa people did not sleep. Dressed in their finest clothes, beaded ceremonial garments brought out for the last and greatest occasion, they gathered on hillsides, riverbanks, and open ridges across the Eastern Cape. They were watching the eastern horizon. Some danced through the night. Some prayed. Some held their children close and pointed toward the darkness where dawn would eventually come. The cattle pens were silent and empty. The granaries were bare. There was no food. But in a matter of hours, the ancestors would rise, and there would be more food than anyone had ever seen. The dead would walk. The British would be gone. Everything lost would be returned, and more. They watched through the night, and they waited for the sun. February 18, 1857. The sun rose. Normally, no blood-red light scorched the horizon. No wind swept in from the sea. No ancestors appeared over the hillsides leading cattle. The British were still on their land. The empty kraals remained empty. The silence was absolute, and it was devastating. People who had watched all night on the hilltops stood in stunned paralysis as the ordinary morning unfolded around them. Nongqawuse and Xhosa did not disappear. They issued new visions almost immediately. New explanations. New deadlines. The hard ones had corrupted the faith. The ancestors had been offended. More was still required. But the explanations were wearing thinner now. And across the Eastern Cape, among the families who had destroyed everything, the dying had already begun. The famine that followed the failed prophecy was among the most catastrophic in African history. Approximately 40,000 Xhosa people died directly of starvation and starvation-related disease in the months after February 1857. Another 40,000 abandoned their ancestral lands entirely, crossing into British-controlled territories as skeletal refugees. They arrived with nothing and signed labor contracts they could not read, becoming, in practical terms, indentured servants. The population of British Kaffraria collapsed from approximately 105,000 people in 1857 to just 27,000 by 1858. 74% of the population gone, vanished through death or displacement. An entire civilization had ceased to exist as a functioning independent entity, not through military conquest, but through the catastrophic mechanics of collective faith. Within months of the prophecy's failure, British Governor Sir George Grey seized over 600,000 acres of now-empty Xhosa land and resettled it with European colonists. Grey had been fighting the Xhosa for years with limited success. Now, without firing a single significant shot, he had everything the colonial project had long desired. In the decades after, historian J.B. Pyers carefully examined archival evidence, suggesting Grey may not have been a passive observer. His research indicates Grey may have had agents and informants embedded within the Xhosa community who quietly encouraged the cattle-killing movement, recognizing it as the opportunity to permanently break Xhosa resistance at no military cost. The evidence is not conclusive, but the beneficiary of the catastrophe was never in any doubt. Chief Sarhili was exiled from his ancestral lands in 1858. He died in 1892, having never recovered what was lost. Nongqawuse survived the famine. She was taken into British protective custody in 1858, shielded, some historians believe, from the rage of those who had lost everything because of her visions. She was resettled on a farm in the Eastern Cape under the anglicized name Rebecca, and she lived there quietly for the rest of her life. She died around 1898. 40 years. She had 40 years to live with the knowledge of what her visions at the Gxarha River had set in motion. 40,000 dead, 80,000 displaced, a nation erased, a land handed to colonizers. She never publicly recanted. She never offered a full explanation. Whether she was a traumatized child who genuinely heard something at that river, a naive instrument of political manipulation, or something the historical record still cannot fully account for, she took that answer with her. The Xhosa cattle killing of 1856 is not a story from a distant world that no longer applies. It is a documented case study in how collective trauma, charismatic prophecy, escalating commitment, and social pressure can dismantle a civilization from within, faster and more completely than any army. Historians still debate the exact nature of Nongqawuse's visions. She may have been a psychologically fragile child who genuinely believed she heard voices. She may have been a tool in a much larger colonial game. Perhaps both of those things were simultaneously true. What is beyond debate is that 40,000 people died for a prophecy that never came, and the world it promised was never born. If history's most hidden, forgotten, and devastating chapters are what you came here for, subscribe. There are thousands of stories like this one still waiting to be told.